Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think we'll start. We're 2 minutes late, but that's not a big issue. Although in the program, it says that Hannah will be chairing. You're unfortunately stuck with me for this session as well. So welcome back. I hope everyone had the chance to eat something and replenish. So in this session, we'll also have 3 presentations. They're somewhat similar in their theme. We have Christof Royer from the Central European University, Jana Bacevic from Durham University, and we have Igor, Cvejić, Marjan, Ivković, and Srđan Prodanović, who have a joint paper from, they're all from the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. So I suggest we do the same as we did in the previous session, that each of you presents and then can have a kind of a joint discussion. So first off, we'll hear from Christof on ideological struggle as agonistic conflict, a practical political theory approach to anti-hypocrisy, free speech, and critical social justice. So Christof, the floor is yours. If you have a PowerPoint, you should have the ability. Excellent, great. So.
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh. So you have to unmute yourself as well, but great. So there you go.
Thank you very much, Marco. So I take it you can see my PowerPoint slides, right? Perfect. Yeah. Good. So hi again, everybody. My name is Christof Royer. I come from Central European University. As I said earlier, I'm a postdoc fellow there. And first of all, let me thank the organizers of the conference so much for putting this together. I think it's a great conference and I've learned so much already. And as somebody who is organizing academic events at the moment as well, I know from experience how difficult it is to put together academic events in these COVID-19 ridden times. So thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the chance to present this paper to you. So I should probably start by saying that this paper has now quite a history. I've been working on it on and off for the last year. I've submitted it to a journal, Constellations, which is an American journal for radical democratic theory. And it has just been rejected by Constellations. It was a rather narrow decision. So reviewer number 1 said, okay, that's a good paper, publish it. Reviewer number 2, and as we all know, it's always reviewer number 2, right, said that, no, this paper feels disjointed and it makes actually an unfair criticism of agonistic democratic theory. So I partly agree with the first criticism. I think the paper, now that I've reread it, feels a little bit disjointed. I still disagree with their second criticism. I don't think that I'm making an unfair criticism of agonistic democratic theory. And I'm saying this because I would really love to hear your feedback, especially on these 2 points as well. And especially if I should take on reviewer number 2's advice of making these paper as 2 papers, actually. Okay, so to start with, I would like to talk a little bit about the conference theme, engaged political philosophy, or what I call a practical political theory. What I mean when I talk about practical political theory is the approach that I actually have in my research, that I think that on the one hand, political theory, or if you will, political philosophy, I don't think the difference is that important, that political theory should inform, or that it informs our political practices and our political phenomena. But at the same time, and conversely, I also think that concrete phenomena, what's going on in the world of politics, can actually illuminate our theories. They can help us to tease out the weaknesses of our theories, and they can help us to see the weaknesses of our theories. And this leads to the purpose, the fundamental purpose of this paper. So what I'm trying to do in the paper is to illuminate a concrete contemporary phenomenon. And this is the struggle between advocates of critical social justice and defenders of free speech through the lens of agonistic theory. And on the other hand, to use this concrete phenomenon, to use this struggle as an impetus to carve out and address certain weaknesses, or what I see as certain weaknesses in the theory of agonism. I ask, how should a practical political theory approach this ideological struggle? And I will say something about the word ideology a little bit later, because it's an important part of the paper as well. And what I'm trying to do, and I will come back to that in a minute, is I'm trying to defend an agonistic approach against two alternative approaches. And the first alternative approach that I've identified is the argument that there is conceptually no real conflict between critical social justice on the one hand and free speech on the other. The second approach, the second strategy is to simply take sides in the conflict, to either come down on the side of critical social justice or the free speech movement. And my main argument here is that although this struggle, which is characterized by mutual accusations of hypocrisy, often lacks what is called in the literature agonistic respect, it should nonetheless be understood as an agonistic conflict. So the welcome and very important expression of a diversity of views on central social, moral, and political issues. And I start the paper with a sort of epigraph by Judith Clark. So I was very happy to hear Jonathan talking a little bit about Judith Clark in his keynote address. She was the first female professor at the government department in Harvard. And she writes in her book, Legalism, what on earth is so impressive about agreement and unity? And I will come back to this epigraph and I will make clear why I use this as an epigraph, why I think it is important. So if we come to the ideological struggle between the critical social justice movement on the one hand and the free speech movement on the other, this, as you might know, has been going on for quite some time, but I really think that the culmination of this struggle actually happened last summer, around July and August, with first the publication of the famous letter on justice and open debate in Harper's Magazine, which was a letter that was signed by, I think, approximately 100 mainly American political theorists and thinkers. And they were attacking what they saw as a fundamental development on the political right, within political left, within academia and journalism and activism as well. And they write that the free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, and this is the controversial point now they're making, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. And I have to confess, when I read this letter online for the first time, I thought, yes, that's it. I really sympathize with that approach. And then, to my surprise, a second letter came out a couple of days later, where the critical social justice movement actually responded in a sort of rejoinder to the letter on justice and open debate, and they called it a more specific letter on justice and open debate. And they pushed back against this argument. And they say in the letter that the signatories, many of them white, wealthy, and endowed with massive platforms, argue that they are afraid of being silenced, that so-called cancel culture is out of control, and that they fear for their jobs and free exchange of ideas, even as they speak from one of the most prestigious magazines in the country. And I thought, yeah, that's a pretty good argument as well. And I tried to wonder how a practical political theory should approach this conflict, which is for me an obvious conflict. And the first point, I call it sometimes the academic argument, is that if we look deep enough and if we analyze this conflict on a conceptual basis, then we will see that there is actually no clash between freedom and justice in this regard. And I have a certain amount of sympathy for this approach, as it seems to be less controversial, as it seems to reconcile these two positions and not just leaving the conflict in place. But I also think that it is flawed in some respects because it glosses over the very obvious fact that there is a very real conflict going on between these two camps. So that's not really an option for me to say that there is no conflict, right? Conceptual analysis will show that there is no conflict. I don't want to go down that road. The second part, or the second approach, is to take sides in the conflict, to either come down on the side of the one camp or the other camp. But there's a problem with that strategy as well. And the problem is that if you look a little bit closer at the discourses of the two camps, then you can see that actually the accusation of hypocrisy is central to both discourses. And the problem is that both camps are actually right, in my opinion. So critical social justice advocates say that the free speech camp actually curtail free speech in the name of free speech. So they basically say that, well, if you are advocating free speech, then we should be allowed to speak very freely about that issues. What you're trying to do is, or what you are, is you're hypocrites because you curtail free speech in the name of free speech. And that argument has been made in the literature, and I find that quite convincing. The argument that is not often found in the literature is that that goes the other way around as well. That free speech advocates can argue against social justice advocates, that critical social justice advocates actually portray diversity and plurality as their most important values, but they are very happy to curtail diversity and plurality in the name of social justice. So what we see, I think, is that both camps are actually vulnerable to the charge of hypocrisy. And I really think that is being built into the two discourses. So there's no way around that. This leads me to the third approach. And this is the agonistic approach that I'm trying to defend in the article or in the paper. The agonistic approach endorses the conflict. I don't know how many of you are familiar with agonistic democratic theory, but at the very heart of agonism is the belief that certain struggles and certain conflict have emancipatory potential, and that they can be positive things in moral and political and social life. So I'm trying to endorse the conflict, and I'm trying to endorse the conflict, and this is controversial, even if we have these two discourses of mutual accusations of hypocrisy. And in trying to develop this argument, I'm turning to the philosophy or political theory of Judith Clark, who has written very eloquently, I think, on hypocrisy and importantly on anti-hypocrisy. And I'm trying to link her ideas on hypocrisy and anti-hypocrisy to her shifting conceptions of ideology and liberalism. I call that Clark's two phases of liberalism. So I'm riffing a little bit here on her book title, Phases of Injustice. So Jonathan said in his keynote speech that Clark was one of these thinkers who thought that it is important to think about injustice, not just about justice. Srđan Clark has this great book, Faces of Injustice. And I'm riffing on that, and I'm trying to tease out two phases of liberalism in Clark's work, one conservative and one progressive. Starting with the conservative liberalism that she develops, her most famous account of conservative liberalism is in her essay, The Liberalism of Fear. But for our purposes, more interesting, I think, is her book, Ordinary Vices. So Ordinary Vices is a book that tries to rank certain ordinary vices, as she calls them, according to the threat they pose to liberal regimes. For Clark, by far the most serious threat to liberal regimes is cruelty. Hypocrisy, on the other hand, is only a minor vice. It's not as important and not as threatening as cruelty. And she develops her argument about hypocrisy in 3 steps. First, she says that hypocrisy is an inevitable feature of a liberal order. We can talk about this argument in the Q&A if you wish, but I'm just going through them very quickly now. So hypocrisy is an inevitable feature of a liberal order, but then she makes a more provocative and more radical step. And she says that hypocrisy also bolsters or supports a liberal order. And in a 3rd step, and this is the major point of the book that is often missed, I think, she says that the real danger to liberal order or liberal democracies is not the hypocrite, but what she calls the professional anti-hypocrite. The one who tries to flag up hypocrisy, the one who actually constantly problematizes the hypocrisy of liberal regimes and liberal orders. And this is where I come to the problem, the really serious problem that I have with Clark's account of hypocrisy in Ordinary Vices. She says, on the one hand, I think it's on page 63, that the ideological combat of hypocrisy versus anti-hypocrisy is what she calls the normal character of political discourse. It is inevitable. It comes up in liberal democracies and in liberal regimes. But then at the same time, she also laments that this is actually a language of distrust that uses threats rather than arguments. But my problem here is that Clark's target here is not conflict per se, but ideological conflict. But even so, what she's trying to do here is to wish away the ideological conflicts that, according to her own words, are actually inevitable. So you have, on the one hand, the argument, well, this is inevitable. We have that in liberal democracies. But on the other hand, she says, well, but we shouldn't have it, right? It's a language of distrust. It's a vicious cycle, if you wish. So I think that Clark's argument in Ordinary Vices doesn't lead very far. This is why I'm turning to her book, Legalism, which was published a few years earlier, in which I find a much more interesting form of liberalism that I call agonistic liberalism. In Legalism, she says explicitly that her liberalism that she wants to defend is based on a defense of social diversity, committed only to the belief that a diversity of opinions and habits is not only, and this is important, is not only to be endured, but to be cherished and encouraged. So there was a lot of talk about John Rawls in the first 2 sessions. And what distinguishes Clark's approach to liberalism from Rawls is that Rawls is very explicit about diversity and plurality as a fact of political life. Clark is in that regard much more radical, if you wish, much more of a radical Democrat. For her, plurality and diversity is not only a fact of political life, but it's a value of political life. And this notion of plurality and diversity as a value also leads to a shifted notion of ideology that she has in this earlier book. So she received a lot of criticism for that book, especially from lawyers, which is not too surprising because she portrayed legalism as a sort of ideology. And in the second edition of the book, she confronted this criticism, and she said, well, I was a bit naive, you know, I was using the term ideology and I should have known that lawyers will give me a hard time about that. But what I mean about ideology here is eminently a matter of attitudes common to groups of people. It's the sort of preference that arises in the course of common social experience. In other words, what she means by ideology here is merely a political preference. So she's not painting ideology with a negative brush, as we very often see in contemporary political theory, but for her, ideology is simply something that we have and something that we cannot get away from. And these 2 points, value of diversity on the one hand and ideology on the other, leads to the point in legalism that exclusion is by far the most existential threat to societies and the prime value of diversity. So we might say she's very suspicious of this fetishization of harmony and unity. And this explains why I'm using the epigraph at the beginning of my paper. She says, what on earth is so impressive about agreement and unity? And that's a rhetorical question, of course, because her answer is nothing. It's actually very dangerous to have agreement and unity. So I'm trying to open up this space for my agonistic approach through the analysis of Judith Clark and her 2 phases of liberalism. And in the third or fourth, actually, part of the paper, which is the most important part of the paper, trying to answer 3 questions. The first question is, can the conflict between critical social justice on the one hand and the free speech movement on the other really be interpreted as an agonistic conflict? The second question is, what is the potential of such an interpretation or of such an approach? And third, and importantly, what are the risks and dangers of an agonistic approach? So when I'm asking the question, is this really an agonistic conflict? This is precisely where I'm trying to tease out the weaknesses, so to speak, of contemporary agonistic political theory. And again, I was criticized for that by one of the reviewers, but I still think that my point stands here. One of the fundamental characteristics of agonistic democracy is that the agon, the struggle, the productive conflict, the emancipatory conflict is characterized, and actually has to be characterized, by an ethos of mutual respect and appreciation for the opponent. And I think we can find this notion of agonistic respect in all of the contemporary agonistic theories, from William Connolly, who uses that term explicitly, agonistic respect, to James Tully. And even if you look close enough in Chantal Mouffe and also in Bonnie Honig and other contemporary agonists. My counter argument here is that this actually minimizes the scope for truly agonistic conflict. So my counter argument basically is, I don't know of any social or political conflicts in which both parties display this ethos of mutual respect and appreciation for the opponent. So we're supposed to be in Serbia, right? I think the agonistic idea of conflict is a little bit like a tennis game between Novak Djokovic and let's say Rafael Nadal. It's a conflict on the tennis court in the arena where both giants of tennis, right, have a mutual ethos of respect for each other. Of course, they struggle with each other and they try to beat each other, but still, this conflict is characterized by mutual respect and an ethos of appreciation. And I don't think that political and social conflicts work like a tennis game. I think that the idea of the Agon, when it is linked to this ethos of mutual respect, becomes practically obsolete. I think it is a noble idea. I think it's an interesting idea, but I think in political practice, conflicts work differently. So I'm accusing agonistic Democrats here. They sometimes, so agonistic Democrats, always, are picking on Habermas for coming up with this ideal speech situation. And I say that actually agonistic Democrats do the same because they envision an ideal conflict situation. And that problem leads us to two options. The first option, I think, is we can lower the threshold for conflicts. I'm drawing here on Jonathan's colleague at Oxford, Teresa Marjan, who wrote a great book entitled Mere Civility. So we can draw on the idea of mere civility rather than more civility. Or the second one is we can accept that the agonistic approach is futile. And I think this is an important option, the second one, that we have to take seriously, because after all, not everybody is an agonist, not even in democratic theory. So most people are not agonists. So I'm asking very seriously the question, is taking sides in the conflict not the more promising approach? And here I say that the agonist's major commitment can never be to any specific position, but always to the agon itself. Because if agonists are consistent, they have to be committed to the agon because they see struggle, conflict, in other words, the agon, as having emancipatory potential. So for agonists, democratic struggle and conflicts are valuable expressions of diversity. And importantly, agonists must be opposed to all forms of oppression and domination. And in diverse and plural societies, and again, this is where Clark comes into play, but other agonists as well, unity and permanent consensus and harmony requires the domination, and in the extreme case, even the eradication of one ideological group. Again, what on earth is so impressive about agreement and unity, Clark asks. In any society where moral diversity exists, agreement as an end in itself can only be achieved by totalitarian methods. This is precisely why I think that the agonistic approach is preferable, because I think in the struggle, in the conflict between free speech advocates on the one hand and social justice advocates on the other, the conflict, the victory of one camp can only come through the domination and the silencing of the other. And this is the last thing that I would like to say. I'm very conscious that this is by no means a perfect solution. I do not claim that an agonistic approach is free of risks and dangers. There are certain risks associated with the agonistic approach. One of the risks certainly is that if you take this position, you have absolutely no friends, because you will get criticized on the one hand from free speech advocates, on the other hand, you will get criticism from critical social justice advocates, and I'm somewhere in the middle, in between. The other serious problem here is that, of course, if you advocate an agonistic approach, you don't create any safe spaces. This is an approach that is based on what I call a presumption of inclusion rather than a presumption of exclusion. And when you're operating on a presumption of inclusion, then you have, by definition, include voices and opinions with whom you fundamentally disagree. This is the agonistic perspective. And if you include these voices, then of course you risk that you include those voices as well who try to establish what is today called a cancel culture. The final problem with that approach is that it's really demanding. It's a demanding conception of politics and citizenship. It requires courage. It requires us to get out there to the public, into the public sphere, to represent ourselves and to stand up for ourselves. And Clara is pretty straightforward on that point. She says that without courage, liberal democracies cannot survive. And by the way, Hannah Arendt made pretty much the same argument when she said that politics is not the nursery, right? So I'm very conscious of the fact that this is not a perfect solution, but I would argue that despite its self-conscious, non-perfectionist nature of the agonistic approach, it's still preferable to the alternatives that I identified. So thank you very much. I stop here.
Thank you, Christof. That was a super interesting presentation. I at least learned a lot, and I think, yeah, it touches on a topic that's always relevant. And for anyone who followed the debate among philosophers regarding who is a woman, I mean, that's also, I think, quite one prominent example of this tension that you recognize. So now we'll turn to Jana Bacevic from Durham University, who will talk about what can critique do, from the performativity of critique to the critique of performativity. So Jana, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Good to see everyone, or good to see at least some of you. My presentation will in some ways follow the tenor of Christof's, which I greatly enjoyed, in the sense in which it will engage with querying some of the underlying assumptions of the idea of doing philosophy or doing any kind of theory, producing knowledge in public. But rather than with the idea of debate or disagreement, I will engage with something that I have called the performativity of critique, which is the assumption that critique can do stuff in a very basic, or perhaps not that basic, sense of the term. So the slightly tongue-in-cheek title of this serves to emphasize that, from my point of view, the way that we talk about critique, and that obviously includes forms of knowledge that we see as critical, predominantly those that we ourselves engage in putting forward, do not always act in ways that we tend to think that they act, and that perhaps this is something that we need to take seriously, or that perhaps we need to pay more attention to, so to speak. By way of sort of a short detour, I'm actually really happy to be talking about this particular topic and this paper here, because in some ways it is a sort of, I don't want to say a homecoming, but it is in some ways coming back home for me. I graduated from the Faculty of Philosophy many moons ago, and though I've never worked at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, I was in fact one of the founders of the group for social engagement, or engaged philosophy, through a series of discussions that I've organized again almost a decade ago, I think, or maybe exactly a decade ago. Now with a group of then friends, some of whom are still involved in that kind of work. After that, and also before that, the journey took me sort of a long way around through Central European University, University of Aarhus, University of Cambridge, and now University of Durham in the UK. But one of the things I did do alongside was engage in, I was actually involved in policy advice. So in that sense, my engagement with what interventions mean has followed both an academic and a very applied, or well, relatively applied, I would say, political route. So one of the sources of my questioning of the relationship between critique and its social roles, or the way that we conceive of its functions, came from that. The other is perhaps even more historical, but in that sense, doing not engaged philosophy was never an option for me. Some of you, or those of you who are from this well, from Belgrade and that region might recognize this image. This was basically my first day at uni. So when I started my BA at the Faculty of Philosophy, this is the 5th of October, 2000, the day of, to this date, I would say probably the most significant regime change in Serbia. And whenever we are talking about the start of or whenever we're at the start of the academic year, as we are now, I'm returning to Durham on Monday to start teaching, to start the academic year. I'm always reminded of what my first day at uni back in 2000 looked like. So in that sense, knowledge production and political engagement have always been closely related for me. But that's one of the reasons why I have always tended to query how exactly they are related. So when we assume that critique acts in some ways, or when we assume that our knowledge has effects in the world, what is it that we are saying by, or what is it that we are assuming through saying that? The social, political, historical context of my query in this particular case is, and some other speakers, including in this morning's session, have already touched upon some of these. In 2003, Bruno Latour has famously asked whether critique had run out of steam, and he was engaging not only with thinking about the roles or the effects of his own work, but also with ways in which, say, the concept of, what is in some cases referred to as postmodernism has been used to justify different kinds of relativization. These are kind of longer lasting or longer standing discussions in the 1980s and 1990s political theory that I'm pretty sure are kind of familiar to most of you, but also closer to Latour's own work and closer to Latour's own point, and also quite relevantly for our present context. The social constructivist arguments when it came to, for instance, science, were already at that point occasionally identified or used to justify different kinds of alternative beliefs, to put it mildly, for instance, climate denialism or anti-vaxxerism, and as we see today, COVID conspiracy theories. So Latour justifiably, in my view, asked, well, aren't we in some ways doing ourselves a counter favor by continuing to engage in critique, by continuing to point out that the constructed nature of scientific knowledge, aren't we in some ways giving license to these kinds of theories? The other thing that he pointed out in this paper, which was initially a presidential lecture at Stanford, was the limits of the unmasking gesture. Okay, so we can go out, we can go around pointing out different ways in which ideologies obscure whatever it is that we think that they're obscuring, or whatever particular version of critical theory we are applying in order to point out what kind of power relations the ideologies are actually obscuring, and then what? And this obviously wasn't uniquely nor originally Latour's question. It was a question that has plagued critical theory since post-war, or well, even during World War II's to work of the Frankfurt School, which was a version of the question, well, okay, how come there has not been a worldwide proletarian revolution, but rather, how come we got something much more problematic than that? And also, what do we do now? So in some ways, it's obviously a subset of the question of what is to be done, but it's also a question of what is the relationship between critique and social and political change. To narrow this down a bit, what we're talking about here is essentially a form of disconnect between critique and action. So the idea that more critique, and certainly more leftist or more progressive critique, and I will narrow down some of these terms later on, though not too much, and we can kind of discuss whether there is a pronounced difference in the assumptions of performativity between, say, right-wing and left-wing critique or not. I'm open to a discussion about that, but there is somehow the assumption that more critique means that there's going to be more undesirable social change did not really work out. After the 2008 economic crisis, I think some of the paradoxes of this belief have also, well, in case they have not been apparent, they have become more apparent. So we're hardly experiencing a shortage or a dearth of critique. One of the things that many commentators have remarked upon was that there's been a resurgence of Marxist critique after the 2008 economic crisis. We're witnessing not only a lively sort of publication production, so not only a lively publishing and translation sector in the context of critical theory, but also a in some cases a renewal, in some cases a proliferation or the founding of new journals, platforms, outlets for this kind of critique. So it's not as if diagnosis of what is wrong with the present conditions are exactly lacking. On the other hand, we haven't exactly seen a demise of capitalism either. I don't want to get into these arguments, and obviously there's a longer discussion in political economy as to whether we are seeing some elements of a demise of capitalism. What would a demise of capitalism qualify as? But I think that at the present moment, and especially from the perspective of sort of post-COVID disaster capitalism combined with the climate crisis, it's valid to say that capitalism still seems to be alive and probably quite well. So we're faced with this question of, well, okay, we have more critique, or we have an increasing, I would say, sort of an increasing visibility of critique, but then capitalism is itself alive and well. Now, this paradox of knowledge and action has been in some ways pointed out previously by one of my favorite books, which is Luc Boltanski and Dave Chiapello's New Spirit of Capitalism. And aside what they're actually trying to do, and obviously the New Spirit of Capitalism in some ways parallels Weber's analysis of the ideological foundations of industrial capitalism in the West. But what their essential argument is, and I think it's often not actually recognized as such, and it's not recognized for the innovativeness of what it actually, well, the argument that they made, is that the late 20th century capitalism evolved not through some sort of subduing or resistance, but rather through the incorporation of critique posed by the movements of 1968. Clearly, in some ways, their argument was a bit nationally bounded because they were focusing on France. This is the empirical case on which they have built their argument, but obviously with some limitations or adjustments. That argument is can be extended to the evolution of capitalism in the later part of the 20th century, at least in the Western Hemisphere. So what they were arguing is that this spirit of playfulness, subversion, creativity, and disruption that was key to one kind of critique that they're engaging with, and that's the artistic critique of the sort of the situationists, for instance, etc. Not the other kind, which is the social and political critique, which is closer to what we're discussing or what I will be talking about today, was actually productively enrolled into what we today would probably recognize as the spirit of neoliberalism. And this idea of disruptiveness, this idea of agility, this idea of adaptation is something that we can certainly recognize, I think, relatively easily, including in the most sort of recent or more recent forms of techno-capitalism, including in some forms of techno-utopianism, and that extends to those that see technological solutions or that prefer technological solutions to, for instance, the climate crisis. Now, But that doesn't solve the problem of what does critique of neoliberalism do today? And this is something where my own research back in the day when I was doing, when I was doing my second PhD entered. So I became quite interested in what it means to engage in a critique of neoliberalism from the context of neoliberalism itself. In some ways, obviously, this isn't particularly exceptional. Many other philosophers, including most prominently existentialists, have always pointed out that we are thrown into the world, as it were, our existence precedes our essence, etc., etc. But in this particular case, we are talking about perhaps a slightly more emphasized form of paradox, in the sense in which we are in some ways engaging in a critique of something, but in ways that are reliant on the reproduction of those very conditions that we diagnose as exploitative. In other words, to narrow this down to a relatively catchy formula, the conditions of oppression, including conditions of existence within a neoliberal system of knowledge production, an unequal system of knowledge production, and so on and so forth, are at the same time our own conditions of possibility. And that does, in my view, pose some very specific challenges to how we can know anything about critique and how we can reflect on our own forms of engagement. Believe it or not, the notion of bad faith makes an appearance in a theoretical framework of philosophy that is quite crucial to the work that I have been doing and continue to do, and that is obviously Austin's notion of speech acts. So this is a snippet from Austin's paper from the time at which he's working on how to do things with words, which is also a series of lectures. And he actually tries to engage with what bad faith might mean in this particular case. So I thought that this was really interesting. I think it's worth exploring more. I'm not going to have time to do that, sadly. So what I'm engaging with when I talk about the relationship or moving beyond the default assumption of performativity of critique towards perhaps a critique of performativity, and we'll get to what kind of critique of performativity am I actually performing. I'm not asking what can critique do, because obviously other people have asked this, and there are many and interesting answers to this. I'm also not asking how can we make critique do what it should or what it ought to do, or the slightly, as it were, cheaper version of this question, which is, how to save critique from selling out, and then you can enter the sort of the adequate edition, how to save critique from selling out to neoliberalism, how to save critique from selling out to authoritarian regimes, how to save critique from selling out or from being used or abused by, say, movements such as anti-vaxxerism or anti-mask movements and so on and so forth. And least of all is it a call to action, which is something that my work has often been misinterpreted as. What I'm mostly interested in, or what this project fundamentally is a call for a reevaluation of a political ontology of speech acts. So one question I'm asking is, why do we even assume that critique should act in certain ways? So why do we in fact have normative assumptions when it comes to critique? And the other is, what does this assumption do? To explain or to illustrate a bit what I mean by this, here are a few photos. So my partner's cat has a habit of lying flatly on her back with her feet propped up in a way that you can see displayed in these two photographs. I'm not really sure why she does that. I've never been sort of a cat person myself or a cat owner myself. It is my partner's cat. So I've never actually encountered the cat lying down like this up until the point at which I encountered my partner's cat. But that's just how she lies down, and it might be because she's a bit overweight, or as my partner would have said, big boned. But either way, that's just the way that she lies on the floor, happily. My late mother, at one point visiting her house in Cambridge, you can see my mother there, terrifiedly asked me, "What's wrong with the cat?" And I jumped up, looked, and realized the cat was lying on the floor, so doing the usual cat thing. Obviously, my mother's assumption that something was wrong with the cat was justified because, much like myself prior to that, my mother has never seen a cat lie down in that particular way. But there was nothing wrong with the cat. That's just how that particular cat preferred to spend her, or preferred to align her body when it came to resting or whatever else she is actually doing in moments when she does stuff or when she poses like this. So in that sense, from my point of view, asking what's wrong with critique or what can critique do is subject to the same confusion between fitness for purpose and fitness of purpose, which is, why do we assume that critique fails to act if we do not perceive it as acting in ways that we expect it to act? Now, here's a short detour through the history of philosophy explaining why or where the assumption that critique acts comes from. Obviously, there is the idea that critique is somehow enlightening, meaning that knowledge obviously changes how people relate to their projects and relate to the world. Foucault was one of the many who have highlighted this. There is even more obviously the legacy of Marx's thesis 11 on Feuerbach, which is the idea that there is and what I'm emphasizing here is not the relationship between the two statements, but rather the assumption that there is a relationship. So that there is a relationship between interpretation and social change. And this is the key thing that I want to query. Even those approaches to social critique that have formulated or conceptualized critique as not ending or as not having a logical end, for instance, the idea of permanent critique or relentless criticism of all existing conditions, also initially Marxist and then reformulated in different schools, different strands of Marxist thought, including Lukács and the sort of Yugoslav homegrown praxis Marxism, have included an implicit and then also sometimes explicit assumption of ameliorative purpose of critique. And I've recently had sort of a very interesting conversation with Sally Haslanger about this, who also pursues this idea that concepts have, and that work on concepts, conceptual engineering has ameliorative purposes. Clearly, we're also encountering it in Habermasian and post-Habermasian discourse ethics. And this is one of the things that I think we've seen in this morning's presentations when it comes to, for instance, expanding the deliberative range of scientific advice. So there is an assumption that the more informed our decisions are, that the better they will be. Last but not least, the assumption that critique acts is itself preserved even in post-critical approaches. And I'm referring here primarily to Rita Felsky's work on the limits of critique. And even Felsky, though she takes a very sort of intentionally post-Marx, she takes a very Latourian actor network theory inspired approach to critique, she still starts from the assumption that critique does something, although obviously the performativity of critique in that sense is not necessarily transitive in the sense in which we would tend to think of it in Marxist theories. My question here is, what does this assumption in fact do? So what is the performativity of the assumption of performativity? In other words, in order to do that, I'm just mindful of time because I'm realizing that we're going to have to run through a lot. We need to look at different ways in which performativity has been conceptualized. And obviously, I'm not going to have time to delve into any of these. And I'm assuming quite a few are probably familiar to most of you. So one of the things that, for instance, Austin becomes interested in terms of performativity of speech acts is not how come some speech acts act, but rather how come some of them fail, or rather what are social and political conditions under which speech, including obviously critical speech, including obviously critical interventions, can become performative, or rather what prevents them from being so. Austin, being obviously a philosopher and not a sociologist or an anthropologist, doesn't really go much beyond that. So he notes that there are social and political conditions and that some of them have to do with sort of social structure and consensus, but doesn't really move beyond that. Judith Butler, in her own engagement with, or her reformulation of the concept of performativity, moves slightly beyond that in the sense of, she kind of posits speech acts as the main building block of social reality. There's an analogy with Searle's own, or John Searle's application of the concept of speech acts to social ontology as well. But Butler also engages with the element that has to do not only with words and not only with spoken language, but expands the notion of utterances to comprise different kinds of agency, including embodied agency. But then we also start encountering more interesting approaches to the question of failure. So what happens if certain kinds of speech acts do not act in ways in which we assume that they should? And I'm engaging here primarily with Sarah Ahmed's notion of non-performativity and Don McKenzie's notion of counter-performativity. So what does this mean? In Butler's theory, and this is specifically for Joe, who struggles with understanding Butler, the way that I'm reading Butler, and this is Butler primarily in Bodies That Matter and in Gender Trouble, and she changed a bit, I would say, so kind of alters her take on this later on. What critique does is that it creates an ontological rupture. So it basically makes other, or creates possibilities for other forms of existence, makes other forms of existence possible. In her work, in this particular phase of her work, it is primarily modes of existence or modes of gendered existence that go beyond the male-female heteronormative binary, but also obviously recognizes that it's never completely possible to step outside of the formative framework or formative sphere from which these acts stem themselves. And she also clearly builds on Foucault in this. Sarah Ahmed engages with notion of non-performatives. So speech acts that by the very virtue of being stated prevent certain things from occurring. She uses the example of anti-racist or diversity policies in institutions to highlight the fact that the very commitment to diversity, or stated linguistic commitment to diversity, is sometimes exactly the thing that prevents diversity or anti-racism from being put into practice. And then Don McKenzie has a sort of a tripartite notion of counter-performativity that I won't have time to get into now, but let's kind of narrow it down to one thing. It assumes that certain performatives create effects that undermine the underlying, well, so to speak, structure of reality, that make it impossible for them to act. What I'm claiming happens with critique is, and this is my contribution to, well, not the only one, sadly, but to introducing new and catchy terms. And this one is absolutely catchy and very, 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 very easy to remember. It's paraperformativity, right? So what I'm saying is that in essence, what critique does is that it introduces a completely different mode of justification that can exist in parallel with what it addresses, for instance, with neoliberal capitalism, but doesn't necessarily have any effects on it. So it's not that it doesn't act exactly, but it doesn't act on the plane, and I'm mindful of the sort of stratified ontology implied in this. It doesn't exactly act on the plane on which we would necessarily assume it does act. What it needs in order to be efficient, or in order to be happy, as Austin would have framed it, is a context, or social and political context, in which the mode of justification in speech acts is congruent with the mode of justification where in the domain where we expect critique to have effects. Now, one of the things I'm going to skip because I'm aware of the fact that we're running out of time. So I think one of the things that this points to, and this perhaps, I guess probably sort of intersects very interestingly with some of the things that Christof has brought up. One of the reasons why we're seeing, well, an increasing, I would say, failure or inoperability of critique today is actually down to the ascendance of violence. And I don't want to get into a debate on whether societies are becoming more or less violent. I think Steven Pinker is probably the only person who thinks that they're becoming substantively less violent, or less violent in interesting ways, so to speak. I think we're definitely seeing an increase of, or certainly increased visibility of violence, including everyday and banal violence, as well as sort of the scaling down of some of the rights that were there to protect against it. So in that sense, critique is clearly impotent in the face of this kind of political intervention, because obviously critique is predicated on the assumption of performativity of speech acts. Regimes of violence are not subject, or are not subject in the same way. I would say are decreasingly subject to forms of justification that actually engage in speech acts. Now, what critique also does is it can replace other forms of political action. And thus, in this case, it would be consistent with Mackenzie's account of one of his accounts of counter-performativity. And the third thing that critique can do is become paraperformative. So continue to perform, continue to have effects, but in context, so in parallel contexts to the one or those that it aims to address. For instance, critique can have effects in the academia, but fail to act outside of that context. These are some of the things that I would sort of like us, or I don't know, other people to sort of pay attention to when we talk about what critique does and what critique doesn't do. So one is the question of what does committing critique, engaging in critical theory do? And in ways that go beyond this kind of default assumption of ameliorative or progressive effects of critique. And as I said, we can go back to the question, well, you know, what does right-wing critique do, for instance, in that sense? Beyond equating speech with effects, and this is obviously a challenging notion because we could claim that in contemporary societies, or sort of the social contract is a spoken contract. So it becomes a really interesting question, what happens if we dispense with it, not clearly politically and historically, but if we think about societies as beyond or outside of that. Perhaps one of the ways to think about this are highlighted in, say, Butler's recent work in terms of performative power of assembly. I'm not sure. I'm still split about this. And then last but not least, how does critique feel? So what are the effective elements or effective effects, as it were, of critique? And that's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jana, for that very, very rich presentation. There should be a lot to discuss. But before we go into that, we'll also hear a joint paper from Igor Cvejić, Marjan, Ivković, and Srđan Prodanović from the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. One of them will talk about engaged philosophy and social change beyond the normative recommendations. And well, Marjan will...
Yes, we agreed that I will present the paper briefly, and then Igor and Srđan, who are also authors of the paper, they will take most of the questions. So yes, this was a very ambitious project, and we didn't really I would say we were only kind of, it's a very preliminary set of arguments, although the title sounds a bit pretentious. But what our aim was basically to explore this interesting idea of contingency. And in the previous talk, we heard a lot about Boltanski and his sociology of critique. Well, Boltanski is one of the authors we relied on primarily in our research, and so the papers are very compatible, Jana's and ours. And so we explored this emancipatory potential of contingency, as we called it in the paper. And we wanted to see, we started from this kind of everyday question, why isn't there more progressive social change? And especially, why isn't there more progressive social change over the past 10 or 15 years, especially since the 2008 financial crisis, and now since the start of the pandemic? Because both in 2008 and at the outset of the pandemic, there was a lot of optimism about, the opening up of space for radical social change, delegitimization of existing institutional orders of neoliberal capitalism. And we all remember how this looked like a year and a half ago. Well, this is finally going to delegitimize right-wing populism and neoliberal faith in the supernatural powers of the market and everything else. And where are we a year and a half later? Has there been any major progressive social change? Have there been any major progressive political movements appearing as they had, at least in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis? We did at least have some interesting progressive movements appearing, Occupy in the United States, Indignados and Syriza in Europe, Arab Spring, etc. But even they didn't, in the end, achieve a lot. So this was the starting assumption. What do we do wrong when we try to act in circumstances of what we could call radical ruptures in our everyday life caused by these major contingent events? That was our starting premise. And then we started first reflecting a bit on what is contingency. So what kind of contingent events are there? And to put it somewhat simply, contingency is always a type of event caused by the uncertainty of the social and natural environment. And it's important to notice two things here. First, contingent events, they always are concrete in some sense. And second, they have some kind of scale that is dependent on the level of their uncertainty or predictability. And this determines our ability to properly understand and handle these contingent events. So we can make a distinction between two most common types of contingent events, and we call them adaptive and disruptive contingent events. So adaptive contingent events are numerous everyday contingent events that we deal with without changing our routines in any major way, whereas disruptive contingent events, they, as we call it, open the floodgates for a whole multitude of totally unforeseeable after effects. And the current pandemic is a good example. So one could argue that disruptive contingent events, they put a given social system into a state of perturbation and making the new equilibrium very much sensitive to very small differences in interactions between the elements of a given system. So we also rely a bit on this complexity theory in trying to understand what are disruptive contingent events. So Sylvia Wolby, for example, has a good perspective on this. She says, central to the meaning of the concept of crisis is the notion that something potentially having large, long-term consequences is the result of something small happening in a short period of time. So adaptive contingency, the small everyday contingency, prevails in relatively stable systems that change linearly, while disruptive contingent events mark the beginning of a series of non-linear social changes that could have a radically different equilibrium than the existing one. once we have made this distinction between adaptive and disruptive contingency, we turned to social theory to try to understand exactly what kind of agency, what kind of critique, and what kind of engagement is necessary if we are to use this potential for transformative social change fully in such situations of disruptive contingency. So Boltanski, in his later work on critique, is concerned precisely with how social critique is articulated depending on different levels of semantic security, as he calls it, that exist in a given institutional system. So a semantic security is his term for those situations in everyday life in which we rely on certain interiorized normative guidelines and mental maps without running into any problems caused by the very flux of life. And Boltanski introduces a distinction between world and reality. I think Jana already talked a little bit about this. Reality on the one hand, or instituted reality as Boltanski defines it, refers to all those interactive situations in which this semantic security is relatively high and in which we don't really, we face knowable unknowns, as we could say. So Boltanski approaches institutions primarily as semantic phenomena, and in this sense, his perspective aligns broadly with Searle's influential account of institutions as sets of constitutive rules that bring into being certain forms of human practice, such as football or chess, as opposed to regulative rules which pertain to already existing practices. So according to Boltanski, institutions are instruments, this is a quote, instruments geared towards the construction of reality through the intermediary, and in particular of operations for qualifying entities, persons and objects, and defining test formats. Institutions, according to Boltanski, fix reference, they fix meaning, especially when it bears on objects whose value is important and whose predicates must be stabilized by definitions. So as you can see, semantic security is high when these references are fixed and we are not facing certain kind of uncertainty regarding the most important predicates, the most valuable objects in society. I would say these most valuable objects are the most important normative hypergoods, let's call them the way Charles Taylor does. So crucial societal values, justice, equality, autonomy, and so forth. So this instituted reality in Boltanski can be understood as a certain totality of interrelated institutional facts, and it can coincide with the boundaries of a nation state or a linguistic community, depends where you're looking from. So an instituted reality is always a kind of perspective dependent entity, in the sense that we as actors construct it as we act. It's a totality of those institutional facts that are important for us. And the world, on the other hand, according to Boltanski, refers to all those situations in which the semantic security is relatively low. That is, situations in which our conceptual schemes do not function anymore. They start to stutter, as you could say. And the instituted reality that has framed our social action so far no longer provides clear orientation. And as a consequence, we run into unknowable unknowns. So as Boltanski points out, quote, something of the world precisely manifests itself every time that events or experiences occur whose possibility had not been integrated into the pattern of reality. In that sense, we can say that Boltanskian reality is a subset of an infinite set, which he calls the world. And this is in line with our previous distinction between adaptive and disruptive contingency. If an event inserts a relatively small number of elements of the Boltanskian world into the given reality, we encounter an adaptive contingent event within that reality. For example, a tire on our car gets ruptured and we just replace it with a spare tire. If, on the other hand, this number is significantly higher than the number of elements of the Boltanskian world, we face a disruptive contingency, and that would be the pandemic or the 2008 crisis. But it could also be something smaller, like a very severe car accident that kind of makes us reflect on the adequacy of all traffic rules that exist, not just one particular traffic rule. I wouldn't want to go very much into the details of Boltanski's social theory. I think these distinctions are enough, we found these distinctions important for understanding exactly how institutional reality reacts to both adaptive and disruptive contingent events. But we also need to mention these tests that Boltanski speaks about, the truth tests, reality tests, and existential tests, because these are three levels at which institutional reality is confirmed and strengthened when faced with some kind of challenge. These truth tests are the simplest. They simply affirm the meaning and the value of existing norms to certain rituals like ceremonies, parades, and so forth. Reality tests are those tests where we question the validity of norms in practice. So we don't question the validity of norms as such. We question whether our behavior conforms to these norms in the empirical reality. And finally, we have existential tests, which are rare in social reality, which pertain to those situations in which we question the very reality of reality, as Boltanski would say, meaning we question the very usefulness and I'm sorry, I just need to make one. Sorry, yes. Let me just present this quote by Boltanski, and I'll finish with him about existential tests. So existential tests, unlike reality and truth tests, must not be regarded as having been subject to a process of institutionalization. So they retain an individual, or as people say, lived character, even when they affect a large number of people, but each of them taken in isolation. Only their sharing can confirm a collective character on them. Existential tests are based on experiences like those of injustice and humiliation, but these experiences are difficult to formulate or thematize because there exists no pre-established format to frame them, or even because, considered from the standpoint of the existing order, they have an aberrant character. For this reason, they are often called subjective, which makes it possible, when the one who experiences them seeks to share them with others, to deny their reality, disqualify them, or ridicule them. So as we see, Boltanski claims that when we are faced with situations of disruptive radical contingency, we can't easily achieve intersubjective understanding about what has happened, and especially not about what is to be done to change the instituted reality. And this is one reason, perhaps, why the emancipatory potential of events such as the pandemic or the 2008 crisis has not been utilized, has not been realized through some kind of progressive social change. People simply could not achieve some kind of shared perspective and mutual understanding fast enough before agents of social domination started acting and closing this gap. Now, what do we mean when we say that? So for Boltanski, other crucial concepts are concepts of critique and domination. And as we already had the chance to hear in the previous talk, critique basically means for Boltanski questioning the validity and functionality of existing institutions through these different levels of tests, primarily through what he calls reality tests. So a critique means juxtaposing a nominal normative order of a given institution with its kind of empirical functioning, with all the deviations that it produces. And this is what Boltanski calls the hermeneutic contradiction. And that's also one crucial term for him. A hermeneutic contradiction is a contradiction between an aspiration of a certain institution to totally cover up and control the flux of life, the world of contingency on the one hand, and to totally reduce uncertainty and any kind of semantic insecurity, and the reality of its impossibility to ever do that completely. So this is the hermeneutic contradiction is at the heart of the institutional reality, and the goal of critique is basically to point at this contradiction and to open it up in those situations in which the institutional reality does not work well, but the institutional reality nevertheless tries to deny or mask this kind of fact. And why does this happen? Because the institutions have an ingrained tendency to persevere, let's say, to persevere in their current form, not to change just because something started basically challenging their functionality or their validity. And how the institutions do that, how do they try to basically persist in an unchanged form? Well, they do that through techniques of domination. For Boltanski, basically domination means masking the hermeneutic contradiction. And this can be done in numerous ways. Boltanski distinguishes mostly between what he calls simple domination and what he calls complex domination. And we will come back to that later. For now, let me just say that simple domination is simply negating the hermeneutic contradiction between institutional reality, between, let's say, the claims to validity and the reality of institutions. It can take the form of brutally suppressing social critique, or it can take the form of ideological indoctrination, which is more often the case in liberal democratic societies. And then there is complex domination, which basically does not directly negate or mask the hermeneutic contradiction. It accepts the hermeneutic contradiction, that is especially in situations when the world ruptures institutional reality in a serious way, but then it basically tries to handle this kind of crisis. When I say it, I mean actually agents of domination. Of course, domination is embodied primarily in what Boltanski calls institutional spokespersons. So those individuals who have been granted the authority to speak, for instance, to embody the institutions. And there is a wide variety of these spokespersons. It doesn't have to be political officials, bureaucrats. It can also be managers of companies, journalists, etc. So all people who are engaged in basically handling the hermeneutic contradiction in such a way that the institutional reality doesn't change in the end. Now, we used all of these terms by Boltanski, but then we ran into some kind of limitation of his perspective. And before I come back to complex domination, which I will come back to by way of an example that we analyzed, let me first try to explain what we saw as this intrinsic limitation of Boltanski's perspective. So as we already saw in the quote about the existential tests, he doesn't harbor much optimism about the possibility of collective action in situations of disruptive contingency. As he says, these existential tests, these experiences of a loss of legitimacy of an entire institutional system are very personal and individual and hard to communicate to others, because they're also very situated experiences. Because as I already mentioned, our institutional realities are perspective-dependent entities, context-dependent entities. So Boltanski, in our view, underestimates the potential of social actors to reach mutual understanding in situations of radical contingency, and also underestimates the role that theory or philosophy can play in such situations. And then we turn to some alternative sources which we thought could help us elaborate these insights by Boltanski in the direction of some kind of more optimistic perspective regarding such prospects for intersubjective understanding. So we turn to some sources in analytic philosophy, primarily in social ontology. For example, we considered the issue of directing one's attention towards some phenomena. And we started by assuming that what all instances of social engagement, including philosophical engagement, have in common is that the engaged actor directs her attention towards some concrete shortcomings of the existing or desired rules of action. So there is a reflection about the given rule and norm of action, as well as their implications on the part of the engaged actor. For example, a traffic light needs to be installed on a dangerous crossroads where traffic is currently regulated through stop signs, or a company for which I work is conducting some illegal practices and I decide to blow the whistle on the affair. Or after many years of unjust treatment of subsegments of the population, members of a given community declare at a rally that the whole society needs to change in order for these unjust institutions to be abolished. So all these examples suggest that the shortcomings of the given norms and rules of action are declared or somehow called out to our interactive partners. And that means that these shortcomings have become objects of common knowledge, as David Lewis would define them in with his important concept of common knowledge. And this is done through the establishment of joint attention to this. This is another important term, joint attention. This kind of collective knowledge presupposes that the group of actors who all individually know that, let's say, their company is conducting illegal practices, or they all individually know that the totality of social rules needs to change, they have a mutual awareness that they all know this same fact. That's the crucial aspect of common knowledge, as opposed to just many instances of individual knowledge next to each other of the same kind of knowledge. So this moment of declaration to others is crucial for every act of engagement because it highlights potential changes in the social norms and rules. And then finally, there is some sort of agency of the engaged actors directed toward changing or amending the rules and norms that are seen as deficient. So we have these building blocks of engagement: reflection, declaration, joint attention, mutual awareness, and agency. We wanted to explore a bit more this fruitful concept of common knowledge. Igor can tell you more about that in the discussion. I wouldn't want to bother you now with technical details. What is important there is that we can distinguish between the I mode of joint attention and the we mode of joint attention, and that is a qualitative difference. So in the I mode of joint attention, there are two actors, and we both see a certain event and have a common knowledge about it as two random strangers. And then we can also have this kind of experience, not as two random strangers, but as friends. And in that case, I will not only perceive the event as you are perceiving it, I will also recognize its significance for us and our lasting friendship. That can be an example of the difference between the I mode and the we mode perspective. And the second one, the we mode perspective that has been elaborated by Raimo Tuomela, is very important for understanding how engaged communities, how collective actors of engagement come to be. Yes, what is also important to mention here is this moment of call, which is how the we mode joint attention is established in situations of low semantic security. So now we can start, looking at how Boltanski's perspective can be elaborated along the lines of these concepts. Let's say the first and most obvious function of a call is a communicative one, the function of getting the recipient to take up one's message or calling the other's attention. So acts of call have to be recognizable. If they're not recognizable, they cannot be understood as the type of act they are. And then in situations of low semantic security created by the disruptive contingent event, it becomes harder to make a recognizable call. This is where Boltanski is right. And then beyond this basic function of calling the other's attention, calls also have a normative function. And this is where Bennett Helm, another theorist of intersubjectivity, is important. So what Helm points out is, quote, to understand what I have termed the call of reactive attitudes in terms of communication, which means the function of getting the recipient to take up one's message, is to miss the idea that they are forms of praise or blame, and so are ways of holding someone responsible, or in the case of self-reactive attitudes, of taking responsibility. So we can see that there is this normative component in a call, which is very important. And then there is also the dimension of import, as it has been called by social ontologists. So from the objective side of the story, my calling upon the norms and values which bind us at the same time presses some kind of import or significance of these circumstances that we are witnessing and these norms that are being scrutinized. So it presses this import on fellow members to react correspondingly. So I think we now have a basic kind of conceptual framework for understanding what happens in situations of low semantic security. What happens is that these calls between actors are not easily recognizable, but at the same time, we have this kind of directing of attention of a very large number of actors in the same direction. And if we take all this into consideration, we could argue that in a situation of a disruptive contingent event, Boltanski's existential test is not so, how would I say, is not such a solipsistic phenomenon as he thinks. We could argue that even existential tests could be inherently intersubjective experiences. So we could argue that the situation in which Boltanskian world intervenes into reality is followed by semantic and normative insecurity that undermines intersubjective understanding of reality, which is based on existing institutionalized norms of action. However, this is exactly the point at which social engagement in the form of the issuing of mutual calls for trust and responsibility becomes crucial for a new form of intersubjectivity to be able to take shape. And this new form of institutionalized intersubjectivity could be established through the actors' mutual calls to responsibility. So by their, let's say, mutual pushing of import upon each other regarding this disruptive contingent event, such as the pandemic. And this can be, for example, seen in this call, be responsible, this ubiquitous call that we have been seeing in the media and public space since the beginning of the pandemic. This call, be responsible, is the kind of essential form of the pressing of import upon everyone regarding a certain major disruptive contingent event. So an existential test could thus be an intersubjective experience which could be partially tested with others. It is not only that I personally experience major injustice, I'm also experiencing the degree to which others react and acknowledge my calls to them, my pushing of import of this event upon them, as well as the degree to which I experience the others' calls to me, or the others' pushing of that same import upon myself. Now, we also rely a lot on George Herbert Mead and his distinction between the me and the I, and his concept of the generalized other. I don't think we have enough time to go into detail of that. So I will just, let me see. I will just go to the example now to try to illustrate all of these rather meandering points. So we basically analyzed briefly an episode from our own local context last summer, which happened in July 2020. So violent demonstrations broke out in front of the Serbian parliament after the government announced a second COVID lockdown. But why did this happen? It was not a protest against lockdown as such. Very much on the contrary. The first lockdown, which lasted for several months, was very well observed. There were no major protests against it or anything. It was accepted in normative terms. But then what happened is that we have, let me be frank, an authoritarian government, a regime, we could call it, which basically breaks all institutional norms and rules when it comes to its own preservation, and has shown a blatant disregard for human life. So what they did is there were elections coming up in late June last year, and these could not be postponed. And there was a threat of a political boycott of these elections because a part of the opposition was boycotting the elections. So what they were afraid was that there was going to be a very low turnout, which would play into the hands of the boycott opposition. So what they needed to do was they needed to persuade people to go to vote And they did this by starting systematically lying about the figures of the numbers of infected, hospitalized, and deceased. And they basically they ran a sustained campaign that the pandemic was over and that everything was safe. They would organize major events, football games, social gatherings. In the end, it was found out that this was a major campaign of deceiving the public, because immediately after the elections, the numbers of infected people skyrocketed. It was clear that the government was lying all the time. Then they announced this second lockdown, and then these major demonstrations broke out because people were outraged by the government's behavior. First, by the blatant disregard for life, by sacrificing people's lives for the sake of their own preservation during the run-up to the elections, and then afterwards for trying to shift all the burdens of this irresponsible behavior on to the citizenry. This was the, let's say, the crucial point that people were not going to accept. So all kinds of people came to the Parliament Square, all kinds of ideological orientations, identity groups, nationalists, anti-nationalists, leftists, rightists, and it was a very, very, I would say, chaotic event. And then there was some violence as well. And then we, in the end, this dissipated rather quickly. Nothing came out of it, except that the new lockdown was not imposed, so the regime backtracked. But what is interesting about this example is that it constitutes a clear example of what we call this negative common knowledge. So this minimal common knowledge that constitutes in some kind of a joint attention to a given contingent event, and some kind of mutual awareness that we all know, and this we is in this case the we who gathered in the Parliament Square, that we all know that something is deeply wrong with our institutional reality as a result of the major contingent event, the pandemic in this case. And this negative common knowledge, we argued, is this kind of basic intersubjectivity that exists even in situations of radical semantic insecurity, contra Boltanski's view that there is no such thing, that there are only individual experiences of radical uncertainty. So within this example, what is important to understand is that there was this kind of this kind of negative common knowledge. I see that my internet connection is unstable. Let me just, okay, I'm back, yeah. Right, so now let me just try to be very, very concise. So when I mentioned that there is this thing called complex domination, according to Boltanski, complex domination means the kind of domination that tries to handle a certain major contingency in such a way that it prevents substantive institutional change, but it does not negate the existence of the crisis. On the contrary, complex domination is the kind of domination that advocates constant social change, that advocates the kind of, it creates a cult of change for change's own sake. But then it delegates the task of defining what kind of change is necessary to certain institutional spokespersons, namely experts. And experts are those who stand above or ordinary actors' disputes. They have the authority to position themselves, what Boltanski says, at the intersection of world and reality, not inside reality. And in our example, experts of various kinds, let's say political commentators, but also journalists, especially journalists of one independent television station called N1, were the ones who were engaged in interpreting the kind of disruptive contingency that occurred and in navigating the kind of social dynamic that was created in such a way as to prevent substantive social change. And we just conducted a basic kind of discourse analysis of these actors and what they share, what they all had in common in their commenting on these protests is that these the violent dimension of these protests was not genuine. it could not have been genuine because there is this major division, let's say, between kind of non-violent citizenry which opposes the regime, which you could call progressive, left-wing, or liberal, or whatever, and the violent groups which are all associated with the extreme right. Now, what their logic of commenting on these protests was, if there was violence, then that means that there were elements planted by security services into the protesters in order to start clashes with the police, so that the police could intervene and break up the protests. And the rhetoric basically negated any kind of possibility of radically new forms of behavior of social actors who have experienced radical disruptive contingency. So radical disruptive contingency is acknowledged, but what is not acknowledged is the capacity of social actors to achieve mutual understanding on the basis of which they could even change their previous patterns of behavior. What was negated is the capacity of the experience of injustice or the experience of moral outrage to, in a way, re-socialize social actors in the wake of the radical contingent event. And that is how complex domination basically works. In its, let's say, we could say that complex domination obstructs the communication of the call of a group of actors to other groups of actors to direct their attention to the disruptive event. And by disabling the communication of the call, domination incapacitates different groups of actors to experience mutual trust. In other words, the mutual awareness or joint commitment cannot be established in the end. And what we wanted to show through our analysis of this example of the violent protests is not just the logic of the complex domination, but the basic intersubjectivity that in the end did survive even these processes of complex domination. And that is the kind of new layer of identity of all social actors who are involved, in the sense that they now all understood themselves also as you know, members of some kind of collective, which is now aware of the radical loss of legitimacy of the institutional order. And there is still potential in that respect for this to evolve into some kind of positive intersubjectivity. So although this disruptive contingency of the pandemic, compounded by the government's actions, created this initial negative common knowledge, let's say the full potential of the emancipatory potential of contingency was in the end not realized in the form of something we could call a new normative circle, but it can still happen in some time in the future. But this example also points to the fact that even this initial state of the protesters was not that of a multitude of isolated individuals, but that of a minimal intersubjectivity consisting of the actors' mutual awareness of their comprehension of the normative significance of the disruptive event. And this even domination could not fully eradicate these effects of this mutual awareness. And this residual mutual awareness gains a further foothold, is a way how world gains a further foothold within the institutional reality. Now, what can theory, engaged philosophy, do to prevent complex domination from destroying the emancipatory potential of contingency? And this is how I'm going to conclude. And we list several things that non-authoritarian, epistemologically non-authoritarian engaged theory, which does not simply come and start, you know, applying a certain comprehensive worldview by, you know, educating social actors like classical Marxism does about what needs to be done in such situations, but actually tries to facilitate the communication of calls between different groups of social actors. So, among other things, engaged theory can rely on these kind of protocols in such situations as the one we just mentioned in Belgrade. It can help making the contents of mutual calls to awareness between different social groups recognizable. So the low level of semantic security in a situation of a disruptive event can make the earlier mentioned calls of reactive attitudes expressed in a given social context hard to recognize. And as we also noticed, one of the main characteristics of such events is that particular isolated expressed calls could have comparatively larger effects. This was studied very, very well by Ivan Ermakov, for example. And this fact immediately raises a challenge to engaged theories to articulate even those calls which are not recognizable to a wider public. Engaged theory can also make normative demands usually hidden in a given call more recognizable. So calls of reactive attitudes always push the import on addressees as well as on witnesses. And in situations of a disruptive event, they could be used to invite others to introduce new norms. However, the normative content is not always transparent to its recipients. And then the task of engaged theory will be to draw attention to these relatively inarticulate normative invitations, not just to the very form of the call itself, but to its substance as well, we could say. Then the third thing engaged theory could do is it can help emphasize further the significance of the event. And there it can rely on certain theoretical resources such as structural injustice or things like that that have been mentioned before. So the recognition of the significance of the event is crucial for this mentioned process of the collectivization of the experience of injustice and the introduction of radically new norms. However, this significance might not be easily visible or easily communicable, and it could be eventually even covered over by domination, whether simple or complex. And engaged social theory can help emphasize the event's significance, for example, the 2008 crisis, by drawing on some kind of more systemic vocabulary, showing that there are these deep structural mechanisms generating injustice, but then not prescribing some kind of homogeneous solution, but leaving this to the social actors, but just helping them realize the significance of the event, which might not be so easily visible. And then finally, engaged theory could point out the circumstances of our dependency, we could say. And this task is intertwined with the previous one and is crucial for the constitution of collective reactions. So given that old robust normative patterns have become uncertain in situations of disruptive contingency, one effective way of fostering collective efforts directed towards resolving this given crisis and thus avoiding general individualization, which is what domination actually aspires to, is to stress the degree to which each one of us depends on others in these extreme circumstances. And by doing that, and here social theory can once again rely on such concepts as intersubjectivity, joint attention, the we mode, the intersubjective constitution of human subjectivity, like in George Herbert Mead's perspective, and many other theoretical resources. And by doing this, engaged theorists will illuminate that not only does a major contingent event have significance for individual actors, but it is our grouping in responding to this crisis that should also be understood as very significant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marjan. That was very, as you stated in the beginning, an ambitious paper that you presented. So thanks. So we have a bit more time, and so I'll just open the discussion. So if you have any questions or comments, either for Christof, Jana, or well, now Igor and Srđan will answer any questions or comments that you may have. So Joe, you raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. Well, thank you all for your papers. I've got I suppose, a rather small question for Christof, and the beginning of your talk, which now feels quite a long time ago. But you had that quote from Judith Clark about, what's so great about agreement and unity, although I'm sure she didn't put it quite like that. And it's a really striking idea. And I suppose that there are two types of challenge to it. And I think you probably covered this. One is that it doesn't really exist. So in those cases where there's a show of agreement and unity, perhaps in some totalitarian regimes, it's merely superficial, so it hides something else. And the other case is where there really is unity and agreement. And I suppose the thought I had, and this isn't really a question, but just something I'd like you to reflect on. First of all, which of these is the concern? Is it the false unity or is it the real unity? And are they both equally problematic or problematic in different ways? So I think it doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't go to either of the questions you wanted us to answer about the structure of your paper and so on, but I'd just like to hear a bit more about that. So thank you.
Marco, do you want me to respond straight away, or do you want to gather some questions?
Yeah, you can answer straight away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. I think that's a very legitimate question. This distinction between forced unity and a second kind of unity, which is probably less problematic than forced unity. I think from an agonistic perspective, even from a Schlarian perspective, probably, but certainly from the perspective of Chantal Mouffe or Bonnie Honig, they would probably respond to your question that every form of unity hides something and exclude voices. So one of the characteristics of agonistic thought is that they are highly skeptical of unity and agreement. That doesn't mean, I think, and that is something that I've thought a lot about. That doesn't mean that agonists, or myself for that matter, are fundamentally opposed to any form of agreement or unity. But what they stress, what agonists stress, is that this can only be a form of temporary unity. It cannot be a form of permanent unity and permanent agreement. There always has to be a place and a potential for breaking up unity and for breaking up this agreement in order to make space for new voices and new inclusion.
Yeah, so I think empirically that's probably true, and psychologically it's probably true. But I'm thinking also about things like cults as well as political organizations. So in a religious cult, it may well be that you do get, at least for a while, real unity with everyone really believing the same thing. And they may have been, they've gone through a process of education or semi-brainwashing. And so I regard that as probably just as bad or worse, but it might be, for the reasons you've given, that there is always a deeper lack of unity. And so the question is just how much is it suppressed? And how deeply is it suppressed? So even in the cult, you might think at some level, there's going to be some disagreement. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I don't quite know how to answer that. I take that as a comment on board. So thank you very much. But again, from the agonistic perspective, every form of unity is to some degree problematic.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions? No one? Okay. Well, then I guess we can stop here. Probably everyone is tired, especially those of you from the UK time zone. You got up earlier than us. So as Joe said in the beginning, Annabelle Lever was also supposed to give a talk. Unfortunately, she has some health issues and had to cancel. So we will end today here and continue tomorrow a bit later than today, so at 10:30, when we'll have another session with 3 papers on topics that are more concrete and related to some of the things that we talked about today. So we'll talk about effective philanthropy, disability, and the environment. And after that, we'll have a panel discussion. So I hope to see many of you tomorrow as well. The Zoom link is the same as it was today. So you don't have to worry about that. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Jonathan, for your keynote lecture. That was super interesting, and all the participants for agreeing and for presenting your interesting paper. There was quite a lot of different topics and from some I would say different perspectives. Some were more analytical, philosophical, others were more continental and more sociological. So that was great. That's something that the Institute nurtures, this kind of different approaches. There's quite a lot of us who do very different things and from different perspectives. So I hope that everyone else also enjoyed all the talks. So thank you everyone once again. And yes, see you tomorrow at 10:30 CET time. So for those of you in a different time zone, make sure to check what is the time where you are. The time zone is this Belgrade, Budapest, Vienna time. So thank you all once again, and hope to see you tomorrow. Bye.